Okay, let's look at the meaning of reparations. The act of making amends for a wrong or injury, or something done or given as amends. It could also mean the payment of damages, such as compensation in money or material paid by a defeated nation to another nation for damages caused by war. Reparations can also mean monetary or other compensations paid by a country to an individual for a historical wrong, like slavery and the atrocities y'all did to us.
Black activists are now demanding $200 million per black person for reparations.
Do not think you are going to win your election if you don't have a concrete plan for reparations. Biden, do not seek a second term unless it's accompanied by an executive order for reparations for descendants of American chattel slavery.
So the equivocal number from the 1860s is $200 million for each and every African American.
Black Americans built the
She was absolutely
USA.
correct. If you look on a timeline, the history of the United States is still fairly brief, and slavery was abolished a mere 155 years ago. It wasn't just the White House that was built using slave labor, by the way. The building that serves as our country's political center, the United States Capitol, was built and rebuilt using slave labor after its sacking in the War of 1812. Although most northern states had abolished slavery by 1804, it's had its fair share of symbols erected using slave labor. If you're familiar with the Trinity Church in New York's financial district, you may not know that the clergy rented enslaved people to build its iconic spires, as well as the wall that used to snake down what we now know as Wall Street. Many of our forefathers were enslavers. Thomas Jefferson's entire property in Charlottesville, Virginia, Monticello, was built and run by enslaved people. Enslaved people also helped build our intellectual centers. Georgetown University, one of the country's oldest colleges, built most of its campuses after the sale of 272 enslaved people in the 1830s. Many schools with storied histories were built in part by enslaved people, including Harvard University's Law School and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. That school's campus was maintained by slave labor until its abolishment in 1865. Poor record-keeping and indifference by early historians makes it nearly impossible to know every contribution made to these buildings, but there's no doubt about how they got built.
Catastrophes must be compensated for.
No.
No.
That's stupid.
So then, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing.
Yeah.
So then, how come there were groups of people that got compensation then?
Okay.
For instance, like Jewish people, Chinese people, Japanese people with the bonds. Like there were groups of people who got compensated.
I don't know.
So it wasn't fair.
What? Well, I'm talking about like when I think about group, I think about reparations. So I mean, maybe if the people were still alive today.
We also need reparations to address this historic and compounded burden of economic disparities. Many people say, oh, slavery, it ended. Well, it ended, but then it became lynchings, and then it became Jim Crow, and then it became redlining, and then it became segregation, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, and then this police violence, which is really just the tip of an iceberg. The training of our police has to be changed. Communities need to be put in charge of their police instead of having police in charge of their communities. So, we need citizen review panels that have the power of subpoena and so on. We need to be able to hold perpetrators accountable through investigations of every death at the hands of police. So there are things we need to do about that violence, but we also need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in my view,
should the government pay reparations for slavery? No. And why?
When there are talks like this, it's boiled down to white families should pay black families. I'm an Irish immigrant. At one point, my family were slaves to the British. Now, I would be paying reparations for things that were done when my family never even lived in the country. Honestly, why should we pay for the crimes of the dead?
Well, those are legitimate concerns.
Well, I think you're right about reparations in terms of if people want it, though, what they need to do is you always need to go back to the beginning of a supply chain. Where was the beginning of the supply chain? That was in Africa, and across the entire world, when the slavery was taking place, which was the first nation in the world that abolished slavery? The first nation in the world to abolish it. It was started by William Wilberforce, was the British. In Great Britain, they abolished slavery. 2,000 naval men died on the high seas trying to stop slavery Why? Because the African kings were rounding up their own people. They had them on cages waiting in the beaches. No one was running into Africa to get them. And I think you're totally right. If reparations need to be paid, we need to go right back to the beginning of that supply chain and say who was rounding up their own people and having them handcuffed in cages. Absolutely. That's where they should start.
So everybody always trying to blame white people for slavery. What about the Africans who sold us to the Americans and to the British and the Europeans? What about the Africans? Do you want to go to Africa? Hell no, I don't want to go no goddamn Africa. Africans don't like black people. We ain't black and we ain't African. I know we're not African. Well, how many of these African countries came back over here trying to save us? If anybody owes us reparations, it's those African countries who sold us. Because the white boy didn't force us to come over here. They bought us. We were purchased. If that's really true, we were purchased. So no, I don't want to go back to Africa. Because Africa owes us reparations.
I wish at this point to particularly to apologize deeply on behalf of the chiefs and people of Gold Coast and Ghana for the atrocities, the cruelty, the inhuman treatment that were committed 400 years ago by my ancestors during the Atlantic slave trade, where over 400 years ago, millions of our brothers and sisters were captured, sold and transported under inhumane and cruel circumstances through Elmina Castle across to the Caribbeans and to the New World. On behalf of the chiefs and people of Ghana, I do render unqualified apology, deep from the bottom of our hearts. Deep from our bottom of our hearts. But one thing that I want you to be aware of, it was not without resistance. Some of our chiefs did fought and resisted. Some of our people did fought and resisted. But we are fighting a losing battle against a stronger army. People with guns, and we had no guns. They deceived us with liquor.
I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. And taken to the Americas, to the Caribbean, to be an enslaved people. What happened here must always be remembered. It cannot be denied. It must be taught. History must be learned. And we must then be guided by what we know also to be the history of those who survived in the Americas, in the Caribbean, those who proudly declare themselves to be the diaspora. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No.
Do you support reparations for black people?
Well, listen, again, we had over 200 years of slavery. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. We had Jim Crow for almost a century. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. We had legalized discrimination, segregation, and now we have segregation and discrimination that is not legal but still exists and is a barrier to progress. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. We have disparities around housing. We have disparities around education. We have disparities around income. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. And we have to recognize that everybody did not start out on an equal footing in this country. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. And in particular, black people have not. And so we have got to recognize that and do something about that and give folks a lift up. That's why, for example, I'm proposing the LIFT Act. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. Give people who are making $100,000 or less as a family a tax credit. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. Which will benefit and uplift 60% of black families who are in poverty.
So by default, it affects black families, but there's not a particular policy for African Americans that you would explore.
But no, if you look at, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. The reality of who will benefit from certain policies, when you take into account that they're not starting at the same place and they're not starting on equal footing, it will directly benefit black children, black families, black homeowners, because the disparities are so significant. So if we focus on the specific issues that have resulted in the greatest disparities, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. And we understand that that's part of why we're doing it. Listen, the reality also is this. Any policy that will benefit black people will benefit all of society. Let's be clear about that. Let's really be clear about that. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No, because whatever benefits that black family will benefit that community and society as a whole and the country. Right? I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No.
Our people need repair. Yes. White folk are rich and powerful, the rich and powerful. Because black folk worked for 310 years as chattel slaves and got not one day's pay. White folk are rich and powerful, the rich and powerful. Because black folk worked for 310 years as chattel slaves and got not one day's pay. The point is, the present generation of whites did not do this. But the present generation of whites are in their privileged position because of what a former generation of whites have done. A black agenda should be put before them, because if they don't accept the responsibility to clean up this problem, America is facing the judgment of God as we sit around this table.
Lamentations 5 and 7, our fathers have sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities. So the fact that we are here in America and we are paying for the sins of our forefathers for almost 500 years is only right that you heathens, you whites, you Africans, you Ishmaelites, you Moabites, you Canaanites, and all the rest of you nations pay for the sins of your forefathers as well. That's just.
White people, I need you to know that your money will not assuage you from your guilt. You cannot pay your way out of this. There aren't enough reparations in the world that you can pay us. And so you think because you write a check or you slide me something in Venmo that you're absolved, and you can tell somebody, well, I gave Dr. Blay $100. I'm not racist. Dr. Blay is going to spend your $100 and still tell you that you're racist. Thank you.
That's awesome.
Joke's on her, because I'm white, I'm not giving her money, and I still don't feel guilty. That was Professor Yaba Blay, and unsurprisingly, she is taught at several universities across this country. This video is a perfect example of why you never try to appease the woke social justice warriors. No matter what you concede, no matter what you give up, no matter how many reparations you give, these people see themselves as entitled and as victims, and out of the horse's mouth, it will never be enough.
I 100% agree that the United States owes the black community reparations, and this is why. It's not about white people owing black people. It's not about white people being punished for the sins of our ancestors. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's about white people standing in solidarity with a community that has suffered grave, egregious injustices at the hands of the United States government. But first, we must decenter ourselves in this conversation, alienate ourselves from our privilege, and hold the United States institutions and systems accountable for the wrongs that they never rectified. From slavery to black codes, to convict leasing, to Jim Crow segregation, to anti-black housing policies, to mass incarceration, we have never rectified our wrongs as a country. If you look at our criminal justice system, 1 in 3 black males carry convicted felon label. That is a real stat. Is it because they're inherently evil, or they just need more personal accountability, or is there something larger at play? All the data shows, by every statistical measure, the black community has been disproportionately impacted by every institution or system in the United States, from education to healthcare to criminal justice system to banking to housing, which we still have de jure segregation in effect today. And when it comes to housing, neither parties are absolved from this, because both parties were responsible for the de jure segregation that we see today. The New Deal by Franklin Roosevelt didn't invent the segregationist practice of housing, but it did institutionalize it. Restricting access to capital for black families while enriching white families, the big reason why we see the generational wealth gap we see today. And remember, public housing wasn't initially for poor people, it was for working class white families. But because of laws and policies implemented by the United States government, it reinforced segregation, because public housing was to reflect the racial composition of the existing neighborhood. We had redlining and gentrification of neighborhoods, the residual effects of all these policies that we still see today. Reparations is about rebuilding and investing in the black community. Our government was held accountable to some extent for the grave injustices that we committed, the atrocities that we committed against Native Americans. We were also held accountable for the Japanese internment camps. But the United States government never made good on its 40 acres and a mule to the black community. Everybody else got paid. The United States was held accountable for these injustices. I'm a convicted felon. I had to pay a debt to society, to the United States government, to the state of Florida, for the crimes that I committed. I was held accountable. To this day, my past is still being used against me. In fact, if I were to go before a judge today, the first thing he would do is bring up my past and say it's probably a pretty good indicator of what my future will be. But we don't keep that same energy for our government. We don't hold them to the same level of accountability and to the same level of scrutiny. So if you're thinking to yourself, I don't know anybody, you're absolutely right. But our government does. And as citizens of the United States who uphold the Constitution, it is our duty, it is our responsibility to hold our government accountable. As taxpayers, as citizens of the United States, we all pay, not just white people. Anytime there's an injustice in the United States by a government agency, whether it's the police department, sheriff's department, any government agency, the taxpayers are always the ones that foot the bill. Why? Because in America, we believe in justice, or at least we say we do.
So last night I was reading and I came across some articles about reparations, and I came across the stats that say that 85% of white America are opposed to giving people of color reparations. Of course, it's the excuse of, well, people of color aren't slaves today. I didn't have slaves, so why do I have to pay? Then I read some other articles about America's history of giving reparations to the Japanese during World War II, Native Americans, how those that suffered the Holocaust have also received reparations. And I thought, well, a lot of people that are saying, well, I wasn't here for that. Why do I have to pay? Well, you weren't here for those things either. Many of you. But we paid. Maybe you or your family members didn't take part in the atrocities that happened to those groups of people. But we didn't oppose paying. You don't see the problem with that?
When white people in the United States balk at the idea of paying reparations to black Americans who descended from slaves, They disagree with the Bible. Reparations are a form of compensation or restitution made to those who have suffered injustice, particularly those in cases of racial inequality, discrimination, and slavery. The idea of paying reparations to Black Americans is not a new one. It has been a topic of discussion for decades, if not centuries. However, it has gained renewed attention and support in recent years, following the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the growing recognition of systemic racism in American society. As a Christian, I believe that reparations are not only a matter of justice and equity, but also a reflection of God's character and values. In the Bible, we see numerous examples of God's concern for the oppressed, the marginalized, and the downtrodden. From the Israelites' liberation from slavery in Egypt to the ministry of Jesus among the poor and the outcast, we see a consistent theme of God's love for those who are on the margins of society. One of the key biblical principles that underlie the idea of reparations is the concept of restitution. In the book of Leviticus, we see God commanding the Israelites to make restitution to those whom they have wronged. Leviticus 6:1-5 says, "If anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security or through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor or has found something lost and lied about it, swearing falsely in any of all the things that people do and sin thereby, if he has sinned and has realized his guilt and will restore what he took by robbery when he got it by oppression or deposit that was committed to him, or the lost thing that he found, or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore in full and shall add a fifth to it, and give it to him to whom it belongs on the day that he realizes his guilt." This passage emphasizes the importance of making restitution to those who have been wronged, and not just restoring what was taken, but adding to it as a form of compensation. This principle of restitution can be applied to the issue of reparations to Black Americans who have suffered centuries of enslavement, discrimination, and systemic oppression. Another biblical principle that supports the idea of reparations is the concept of Jubilee. In Leviticus 25, God commands the Israelites to observe a Jubilee every 50th year, during which all debts are forgiven, all slaves to be set free, and all property to be returned to its original owners. This was a radical idea of economic justice designed to prevent the accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of a few, and to ensure that all members of society had equal access to resources and opportunities. The idea of Jubilee can be seen as a model for reparations in that it seeks to address the root causes of inequality and oppression rather than just treating the symptoms. By forgiving debts, freeing slaves, and returning property, Jubilee seeks to create a more just and equitable society, one in which everyone has the opportunity to flourish. As a Christian, I believe paying reparations to Black Americans is only a matter of justice and equity, but also it is a reflection of God's values and character. Through the biblical principles of restitution and Jubilee, we see a model for how we can address the historical and systemic injustices that have plagued our society for far too long. While the issue of reparations is complex and contentious, I believe that as Christians, we have a responsibility to seek justice.
Psalm 73, 5-8. They are not in trouble as other men, neither are they plagued like other men. Therefore, pride compasseth them about as a chain. Violence covered them as a garment. Their eyes stand out with fatness. They have more than their heart could wish. They are corrupt and speak wickedly concerning oppression. They speak loftily. So these are these heathens, these Edomites. They speak very wickedly and very evil and wicked concerning oppression. But yet, they don't want to acknowledge what their founding forefathers did to our forefathers. How they raped, robbed, and murdered, and all the atrocities that they did to the children of Israel. They don't want to speak of that, but we can clearly see that their generational grandchildren are benefiting off the backs of our forefathers and us today. So they speak evil concerning oppression. James 5, 4-7. Behold, the hire of the laborers, which have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud. crieth, and the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord Sabaoth. Ye have lived in pleasure on earth, and been wanting. Ye have nourished your hearts as in the day of slaughter. Ye have condemned and killed the just, and he doeth not resist you. Be patient therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and have long patience for it, until he receive the early and latter rain. So, bottom line, these heathens is not going to come up off this money. Yes, they owe us reparations, but they're never going to pay it. So that's why the Most High, he has to come back and he has to recompense. He has to avenge for the atrocities and the wrongdoings that's been done to his elect people, his chosen people, the children of Israel. And that's what we have to understand. So reparations is something that's owed to us, but they're not going to pay it.